Greeting X. I wanted to take this opportunity to go live. I've been trying to do this. I've been having issues and interruptions. I'm going to try to get through this without being interrupted again. Um, Wanted to touch base on several current events that have happened, and I've been wanting to go live for a while, but I've just been like really busy with work and stuff. But I didn't want to go more than go without going on live and talking about at least three current events. Um, as you know, this week we had the Iowa caucuses, and there's been a lot of hubbub about it being historic, about the margin votes being majorly favorable to uh, former President Donald Trump. The Iowa caucus, the turnout was extremely low, and I don't think that the amount of credence that it's been given should have been given to it. You're talking about a Republican voting base of about 753,000 people, of which only 15%, which was like about 60,000 people, showed up. Um, you're talking about a margin of 85% of the voting base did not show up. You know, that in itself, just the uncertainty, the tangent of uncertainty in that 85% is just, it's too difficult to ignore, to not ignore. Um, who knows what the result would have been if 100% of the voting base actually voted, or even if 80% of the voting base would have actually voted. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to surmise what the actual result was going to be. That being said, I think a lot of stuff that was done and said was premature. Um, Vivek actually, Ramaswamy suspended his campaign. I think that was premature. I mean, you can't go by such a very minimal turnout to make a decision like that. The fact that you have certain politicians such as Jim Jordan, Ted Cruz that are saying, okay, well, the election is over. We're going to endorse former President Trump. All these things are at the least, or at the most, premature because of the fact number one, a lot of the percentage of the time, the person who wins the vote in Iowa doesn't necessarily win the nomination. So it makes it that much more difficult to accept the fact that, okay, this person may be the person who is going to win the nomination. There's too much uncertainty. So, you know, I would not place my bets on Iowa at this juncture for that reason. I think we need to wait and see how a lot of these primaries turn out over the next few weeks, and then revisit the issues to who is the strongest possible candidate, whether it is President Trump or former President Trump, whether it is Governor Ron DeSantis, whether it is even Nikki Haley. You know, we have to wait and see. I mean, things are too uncertain right now to call it at this stage. I mean, to call it at this stage and say Trump is way too premature. That is I will go out and say that is a 100% fact in this instance. Another thing I wanted to talk about was actually the Representative James Comer and the Oversight Reform Committee, their impeachment inquiry, and the situation with Hunter Biden in that respect. If y'all remember, I have said from the get-go that the validity of this impeachment inquiry was very questionable. I pointed out from the beginning the point of inquiry and the parliamentary inquiry and the point of order that was brought up at the very beginning of this series of hearings. The fact of the matter being that the this entire inquiry should have been authorized by a full House vote, and that did not happen. Now, what makes it more interesting is that recently the committee issued a subpoena to Hunter Biden. He said, "Okay, I'm willing to show up, but it has to be a public hearing." And I think I know I think I know the reason why he was adamant about the public hearing, and it's because of the fact that the subpoena itself was not valid, and he needed some sort of a defense in the event that interview would have gone awry. That didn't happen. He didn't show up. And what happens next is something that I would say is very suspect, and that was that there was a vote taken on the House floor to supposedly formalize the impeachment inquiry. In other words, it was to make it valid. As no sooner did that vote happen, within a week or so later, they started drawing up contempt charges against Hunter Biden. And Hunter Biden's attorneys, I got to give them credit. I mean, when I made my statements questioning the validity of the impeachment inquiry, I knew that I was onto something. But I was more surprised that Hunter Biden's attorneys, they took they had the same ideas that I had with respect to the validity, because they sent a letter to the committee and said, okay, you can file the contempt charges, but these contempt charges are invalid because the subpoena itself is invalid. This was something that I had been saying for the longest time. I mean, if the validity of the inquiry is questionable, the subpoena itself, the validity of it, the legality of it, has to be just as questionable. And the fact that they tried to formalize the inquiry after the subpoena to make the subpoena valid, to validate the contempt charges, that's going to get thrown out. That's going to get thrown out. That is the issue of validity is going to be the demise. It's going to be the one focal point that is going to dismantle, is going to be the catastrophic center point that will bring down any impeachment attempts against the president or against Hunter Biden, simply because of the order of events. Hunter's attorneys know this. That's why they wrote the letter, and they confronted via letter to the committee. They want the committee to be aware, okay, you screwed up. You think this is going to hold up in court. You're wrong. It's not. And technically, it isn't going to, because when it gets to court, certain questions are going to come up with respect to, okay, why did you formalize the inquiry after the subpoena? The subpoena, and they're going to say the subpoena being that it was issued before the committee was formalized, or before the House voted to authorize the impeachment inquiry, makes the subpoena invalid. And what's going to make it worse is that if there is an actual impeachment, and this is something to really think about, if there's an actual impeachment, any evidence, any efforts that were coordinated before the House vote, all that stuff can be declared inadmissible. That would blow the entire impeachment case out of the water. And it's all because of a technicality. It'll all be because of a technicality. The thought of that is very surprising, but it is so critical. It's so plausibly possible that it's hard to ignore. Something to think about, isn't it, huh? Really. Another thing I wanted to talk about was what's been happening with the state of Texas and the U.S. As you know, the Texas National Guard, the DPS, commandeered and seized Shelby Park and Eagle Pass. Shelby Park is a stretch of city-owned land. It's a park where there's a boat ramp, which is basically 2.5 miles of adjacent to the actual border, to the Rio Grande River. And Texas seized it not a few days ago. And suffice it to say, as soon as they did, 24 hours later or 48 hours later, there was a report that Customs and Border Patrol, CBP, went to confront the National Guard and to say, okay, there are 6 immigrants, 3 of which drowned, a mother and her two children, and there are 2 other immigrants that are in distress. We need to find them. We need to save them. And according to the reports, and this is based off of the supplemental briefs that the U.S. Government filed in the Supreme Court of the U.S. on one of the lawsuits that's before the Supreme Court, the supplement says that the National Guardsmen at the gate denied them entrance. When CBP asked to speak to this guy's supervisor, they in fact spoke to him, and the supervisor even said that he was under orders to not let them in. It's documented. So now, when all this came out, this all started because of a post that was published on X by Representative Henry Cuellar. When I initially read this, I was kind of upset that this type of scenario would have occurred. I had not read all the facts, so I prematurely vented my opinions on it, blaming Texas. But my opinion was this, and this is one thing I wanted to clarify: the fact that Texas denied entry to Customs and Border Patrol, or the U.S. Border Patrol, this kind of puts some of the responsibility on Texas. Because if the U.S. Border Patrol had access and would have been fully in the area when this all occurred, even if it was very remote, there would have been a very minute possibility that they could have saved some of the immigrants. I'm not going to say all of them, but I mean they could have intervened, and maybe this would have all turned out a slightly bit different. But in all honesty, my main argument on this was the fact that the National Guard and the DPS denied entry. Not as much whether these people died, whether Texas was responsible for their deaths. I mean, that's not the center point of this argument. Now, what happened here is that, number one, National Guard came back and said that was not the case. They denied what was being said by the government, or denied what was being said by Representative Cuellar. When I saw the denial, I decided, okay, the only way I can approach this is by looking directly at the viewpoint of the Border Patrol versus the Texas National Guard. Now, in order to see the U.S.'s stance on it, I had to look at the supplemental briefs that were filed by the U.S. in the Supreme Court with respect to one of the border buoy lawsuits that is currently there. And in the supplemental brief, the whole time, the U.S. has made this particular statement. They said, okay, we were notified 3 immigrants died, a mother and her children, but we were notified that there were 2 other immigrants in distress. So they were not arguing that Texas was responsible directly for the deaths. The argument was that Texas restricted entry so that the Border Patrol could not do their jobs. That's been their straight argument. Well, this afternoon, Ken Paxton, the Attorney General of Texas, he responded to the letter of ultimatum. Now, let me backtrack a second, because the U.S. sent a letter of ultimatum, I think it was yesterday or the day before, to Ken Paxton, saying, okay, y'all need to cease and desist. Y'all need to relinquish Shelby Park back over. You need to allow us to continue our border operations, basically. And you have until Wednesday to release the park. Well, today, this afternoon, which is Wednesday, Ken Paxton responded, and he was adamant that, okay, we're not going to let go of this, we're not going to release the park, that the list of facts that the U.S. has put out has been in error. He goes to talk about, and I did have it on my computer here, he goes to talk about the Arizona versus USA, or USA versus Arizona lawsuit at the Supreme Court back in 2012, saying that a lot of constitutional crisis issues were not dealt with in that case, such as they would be, because Arizona did not address them, even though Texas is addressing them now. Now, in that same precedent, the Supreme Court said, we understand Arizona's frustration, but that does not give them the right to undermine federal law. In other words, that doesn't give you the right to interfere or to enforce federal law, supremacy clause. Now, another thing that Paxton didn't make mention of, and I think it should have brought it up because it's going to get brought up in these lawsuits, and that is this, that in one of the lawsuits that was filed, and I think if memory serves me correctly, and I may be wrong, somebody could look it up and quote me or comment on this feed and tell me otherwise. I believe in one of the lawsuits, I think it was the one that's in bank hearing at the Court of Appeals, the district court judge said this, because the argument that Texas was making in this specific lawsuit was the argument that, given their sovereignty and their sovereign state, they were able to act accordingly, according to the Constitution, because the U.S. was supposed to protect them in the event of an invasion or domestic attack. Now, it's important that we see, he's referring to Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3, I believe, and also we're talking about Article 4, Section 4. But if we need to look at these articles very carefully, because when you read that, specifically the one about invasion and domestic attack, you're technically, by the definition, not talking about an immigration invasion where you have all these immigrants flowing in. The gist of Section 4, Article 4, Section 4, is in the event that a state were to come under attack, such as, and this is an example, the attack where Russia invaded Ukraine, where Israel has gone and invaded and attacked Hamas, or basically you're talking about a military action. Okay? Because of the manner of which this article is set up, it doesn't necessarily work in the favor of the state of Texas, is what this judge is saying. So, based on that, he said, okay, this is not an issue of Texas sovereignty because Texas sovereignty isn't irrelevant in this type of a scenario. So that's when Texas appealed this case to the Fifth Circuit, I believe, if I remember serves me correctly. Given that this has been addressed in that manner, and it's on the record, this will actually can play against Texas's favor in this particular argument that he's talking about in this letter. So he goes and he talks about that. They also talk about some of the facts that the U.S. is alleging are incorrect, and he goes to supposedly debunk them. Now, a lot of the stuff he's saying that he debunked was not necessarily statements made by the federal government, but more it was the outrage, more than it was the response from the public in respect to the reports that came out. One by Representative Cuellar, which unfortunately I don't think he had all the story at the time when he posted it, and the fact that a lot of these national news outlets picked up on the story and they have been reporting on it. Now, whether or not they followed up on it before they reported, I don't know. But from a lot of the details that I've been reading, they follow very closely to the argument that the U.S. government is making. So this means that the argument that Ken Paxton has put with certain of these facts that were alleged by the public, not necessarily the U.S. government. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. Now, Paxton was saying earlier that they had